U.S. President Donald Trump is stepping up the pressure on Venezuela, ordering a blockade on oil tankers heading in and out of its ports. The U.S. seized one vessel off the coast last week. Trump claims Venezuela uses oil revenues to fund drug trafficking into the U.S. Washington has also moved to designate the government of President Nicolas Maduro a foreign terrorist organization. Venezuela remains defiant, saying its oil exports have not been affected.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro dancing to the song No War, Yes Peace at the Working Class Congress in Venezuela, a state-controlled labor movement. While these images seem playful, the message is serious.
We tell
the people of the United States our truth. Imperialism and the Nazi fascist right wing want to colonize Venezuela. To take our wealth, oil, gas, iron, aluminium, and other minerals.
In a social media post announcing what he called a blockade of Venezuela, U.S. President Donald Trump alleged Maduro was using oil revenues to fund drug trafficking and other crimes. He vowed to continue the military buildup until U.S. oil-related assets were returned. Just a few days ago, the U.S. military seized a sanctioned oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. Venezuelan officials say a de facto maritime blockade has been in place since then. Oil-laden vessels have reportedly remained in Venezuelan waters to avoid being seized. Trump has railed against the nationalization of Venezuelan oil projects in 2007 under Hugo Chavez, Maduro's predecessor and political mentor. The moves hit U.S. companies such as ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips and led to years of disputes over compensation. In 2008, the U.S. imposed targeted sanctions against Venezuela, citing concerns about terrorism and illicit financing. Since then, sanctions have been tightened. Trade between the two nations has fallen sharply, down more than 80% since 2008. Now, US President Trump says his navy has surrounded the coast of the South American country, and that the military buildup will grow until the disputed assets are returned.
Let's take a closer look at all of this and bring in Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez. She's the president of the U.S.-based think tank Inter-American Dialogue. Rebecca, it's great to have you back on the show. Now, the Venezuelan leadership says it's not intimidated by Trump. Do you believe that to be true?
I don't believe it to be true. I think that this blockade, or what President Trump labeled a blockade in his tweet, is a significant step in this escalation pressure campaign that we've seen off the coast of Venezuela. And I would say, one thing I would say is that oil is the Maduro regime's lifeline. So I also see that this could make a difference.
Mm-hmm. How big a blow, let's zoom in on what this means for Venezuela, is this blockade for the Venezuelan economy, because oil is their main source of income?
Yes, I think it will certainly have an impact on the Venezuelan economy. I think that one thing that's important to note is that we have tried a maximum pressure sanctions campaign on Venezuela in the past, and it didn't work. So this is a way, of course, of enforcing that. But I think that this is a significant step. But any sort of policy that pushes for economic strangulation is going to There are other things that are required. One is it's much easier for this to have an impact if the regime is fractured, which it isn't at the moment. Second, if there are military defections, which I think is one of the administration's goals, is to get defections from the military. And the third is that there has to be a credible negotiated off-ramp for the leader, in this case, for Maduro.
Mm-hmm. You say we have tried maximum pressure sanctions campaigns in the past. To what end? What is the end game here? Is it really regime change, or is it access to Venezuela's natural resources? Is this really about drugs? What do you think this is all about? And what does Donald Trump seek to achieve here?
That is an excellent question. And I think there's a lack of clarity around this. I think there are three variables or three potential outcomes. One is the one that we heard early on, that this is about counter narcotics trafficking into the United States. Although, the point has been made on that is that fentanyl, for example, is not coming from Venezuela. And most of the cocaine that's trafficked comes from the Pacific coast of South America. The second is regime change, which we've also heard a lot about. And I still think that is part of this is about regime change. I think what this has done is it's explicitly introduced oil especially in President Trump's tweet, is that this is now another goal of this policy, of what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. But the stated goal really doesn't exist because he hasn't said as much. What Donald Trump has done is that he has declared the Maduro government a foreign terrorist organization. What does that mean in real terms? Does it give the Trump administration more freedom to take robust action? And where could that lead this conflict in which we've seen escalation after escalation?
So there have been a lot of concerns about the legality, in particular of the destruction of these small vessels in the Caribbean. And so this could be part of an attempt to kind of build a legal case to justify what's been happening. One thing, though, that's important to note is, unlike the destruction of the vessels, the smaller vessels, the fishing vessels that we've seen, is the seizure of the skipper was not a military action. It was law enforcement led. The Coast Guard was part of it, which I think is a really important distinction. And I think Trump used the word blockade to describe what will be happening, which connotes sort of a more of a militarized action. But if what we see happening is like individual warrants for sanctioned ships and a law enforcement-led activity, I think that distinction is very important, and I think there is more legal basis for that.
Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez, President and CEO of the U.S.-based think tank Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you so much for your time, Rebecca. Always great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
We're joined now by John Feeley. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Panama and a former U.S. Marine officer. Welcome back to DW, sir. Now, why do you think Donald Trump has ordered the naval blockade now?
I think this is just a continuing step in what has clearly been, for the last 3 months, starting in early September, a pressure campaign against Nicolas Maduro and his regime. It's really interesting. For the first several months, we heard this was nothing more than a counter-narcotics operation, and most observers pointed out the fact that the armada that was being assembled really wasn't appropriate for counter-narcotics operations. I think in the last probably 2 weeks or so, it's become very, very clear that the goal of this is to force Nicolas Maduro to either leave the country or to do something that's still not very clear. We have policy by the president's tweets or Truth Social posts, but what we saw last night announcing the blockade, which, let's face it, is an act of war, which the president is not empowered to declare. Only the Senate or only the Congress can do that. But what we saw was that he wants now the return of expropriated American private company oil assets. So it's all very, very confusing, but it's very clearly a step forward in the pressure campaign against Nicolas Maduro.
Is it just confusing to outsiders, or does Trump himself not know where he's going here?
Nicole, that I think is absolutely the question of the day. I certainly don't have an absolute answer, but observing this for the last couple of months and based on my experience working with then Senator Rubio and the folks who were advising him, I think what you're seeing here is the result of a little bit of improvisational amateurism. I think that Marco Rubio and a number of other folks have long wanted to remove Nicolas Maduro. That's just straight up regime change. I think at the beginning of the administration, the Trump administration, his first envoy into Venezuela was Rick Grenell. That was to negotiate the liberation of some American prisoners and to talk maybe about some preferential oil access. What we saw in the summer was the Rubio camp definitely sort of got the upper hand. And we saw the beginnings of a flotilla. And then we saw, very shockingly, on September 2nd, just outright extrajudicial killings on the high seas of the suspected narco boats. Since then, we're up to about 95 crew members who have been killed. We've had significant congressional interest in the double tap, as it was called. And I'm not sure that Donald Trump really knows what his desired end state is.
He has been threatening to take the U.S. military campaign even further and strike on land. Knowing everything that you just told us, what do you think his next move will be?
Well, this got even more confusing last night, and not just for our viewers, but for me and everyone else who watches this closely. There's a bit of a scandal going on here in Washington with a very revealing interview that Donald Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, gave. And in that interview, she says very clearly that the administration believes it has the legal right to blow up these narco boats, but it doesn't have the legal right to attack land targets. Now, Donald Trump has threatened to attack land targets in Venezuela, but Susie Wiles, as chief of staff, told an interviewer, and allegedly we hear from leaks out of a private congressional briefing by Secretary Hegseth and Secretary Rubio that they themselves admitted they don't have the authority yet to go and attack Venezuelan land targets. That would be very clearly, under the Constitution of the United States, the prerogative of the Article 1 branch of our government, which is the Congress, and the president hasn't asked for that yet. So all of this is being done in a hothouse of tweets and Truth Social posts and statements made by various folks, and it all adds up to pressure. But what is the president's desired end state? I think at this stage, your guess is still as good as mine.
Venezuela's neighbors, too, are very nervous about this, right? Brazil's President Lula says he is worried about Trump's attitude toward Latin America. We just saw this new national security strategy, which very much lines out this return to treating Latin America like the U.S.'s backyard. How does this situation and the pressure campaign on Venezuela affect the entire region?
Oh, it's been terribly destabilizing, I think. I mean, on a diplomatic level, we haven't seen anything like this in certainly my lifetime. President Lula, President Petro, both, I guess you could, leftist or left-wing presidents. Petro, who's got an open war of Twitter or X and Truth Social postings with Trump. Lula, who very pragmatically has had a very good meeting with Donald Trump, gotten the tariffs on Brazil reduced from the 50% that were sort of just capriciously slapped on them for a completely non-economic reason. Every single government in the region is trying to figure out how to deal with the Trump administration's unpredictability and the chaos that it seems to be sowing, and the very powerful weapons of war that it brings to bear. And the same thing is happening inside of Washington, where Democrats are trying to figure out what is the end state. The one thing that remains consistent here, Nicole, is that the American people don't want to see an American invasion of Venezuela, whether it's to stop the drugs, whether it's to provoke regime change, or perhaps provoke regime collapse from within, or even if it's to go and get the oil, which is horribly complicated and a simplistic statement. But the American people, in poll after poll, have shown they don't want a bloody war. They don't want our blood and treasure to die in Venezuela. And that's appears to be the only check on Trump's actions.
Yeah, that was former U.S. Ambassador to Panama, John Feeley. We appreciate your time and insights tonight. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
A real pleasure, Nicole.
Let's get more from Jesus Renzullo. He's with the GIGA Institute for Latin America Studies and is based here in Berlin. Jesus, welcome back to the program. Now, the blockade the U.S. has announced is, against tankers that have already been sanctioned. How badly is that going to disrupt Venezuelan oil exports, really?
Pleasure to be here. Well, quite significantly, if it lasts long enough. Around 40% of the Venezuelan oil that is being sent abroad is from shadow fleets that are sanctioned. Not all shadow fleet of Venezuela is sanctioned, but at least around 40 or 30% is being sent through these shadow fleets, the sanctioned fleets. So if the United States government maintains the blockade, these could damage the Venezuelan revenues really badly, particularly if it creates a huge deterrent in the sense that other ships, even if they are official, decide not to go to Venezuela due to the fear of being seized.
Now, blockades are historically acts of war. If Washington insists this is not a war, what exactly do they think it is?
Well, it is a really gray zone because they are just patrolling the Caribbean and they are just seizing sanctioned ships, which is not unprecedented, and it had happened in other regions without that declaring war. It had happened in Cyprus, it had happened close to the Middle East, and now it's happening in the Caribbean. Now, the thing is here is that it's not a full blockade because technically tankers that are official are allowed to pass, and normal trade vessels are allowed to pass. Now, this still creates a deterrent. Basically, it says even though you are not being sanctioned, even though you are an official ship, you might still get confused, and that deters people from deters trade vessels from entering into Venezuela.
Yeah, very volatile situation in the Caribbean these days. In his social media post, Donald Trump spoke of stolen oil fields. Can you give our viewers some historical context here? What exactly was he referring to?
It is difficult to say what Trump is referring to because he was not specific about it. But if I would have to make a guess, I would think that this is referring to the expropriations of oil companies and industries that happened during the Chavez era, during the ex-president Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias era, where the government engaged in a huge expropriation spree, and some oil fields and some companies that are American-based were expropriated, and some of them were not compensated. This is already in judicial procedures in the United States, mainly in trade courts, in business courts. But it can be that Trump is saying, okay, this has been enough. We have been waiting enough for this compensation, and it's not happening. Again, this is a stretch. I don't know what he's referring to specifically.
The U.S. is also labeling the Maduro regime a foreign terrorist organization. What does that mean in practical terms?
In practical terms, it opens a wider range of capacity for the United States government to operate and basically to engage in violent actions in Venezuela. Terrorism, the application of terrorist, the labeling of terrorist organization allows the executive of the United States to have broader level of action on economic sanctions, financial sanctions, personal like individual sanctions, and in some cases even operations.
So he has more instruments at his disposal right now. What then do you expect to come next? Yeah, port blockades, airspace denial, airstrikes in Venezuela. What are we going to see next?
Well, right now we need to take into account that technically the next thing should have been strikes in the Venezuelan territory. To some extent, this economic strangulation, which happened at a higher stake in 2019, is lower than bombing boats from Venezuela, than bombing these boats that were killing people in the Caribbean. To some extent, Trump is trying to increase the temperature on the economic level so he doesn't have to escalate on the military level. This is, to some extent, hesitation from the American level, from the American state.
We're talking a lot about the what. Let's talk about the why. Why are we seeing this fixation with Venezuela now?
Well, it has to do with the new national security strategy of the United States. The U.S. tries to increase its foothold on what he believes is his natural field of influence. Also, we need to take into account that Trump has a bone to pick with Maduro. He tried to overthrow him in 2019 and failed, and he wants the political prestige that comes with overthrowing the dictatorship in the Caribbean. This is something that has been really recommended to him particularly by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has an ideological goal with putting Venezuela out, Venezuelan dictatorship out. Now, the goal of the why depends on who you ask, because Rubio has a strategic reason, while Trump has more of an ego, political, and maybe some kind of short-term legacy reason.
Regime change is a very delicate and risky operation. Do you see a danger here that the U.S. thinks it's applying controlled pressure when in reality it's sliding into a conflict, a situation it hasn't really decided how to finish, and with an unforeseeable outcome, really?
Well, honestly, I would argue that the U.S. doesn't know too much of what he's doing. He's not planning with too much foresight. What Professor Mark Ward said from Johns Hopkins University is that the United States is engaging not in regime change operations, but in regime collapse operations. Basically, they don't have a huge grand strategy of what is going to happen in Venezuela after Maduro falls. That is the most dangerous aspect of this. The fact that the Americans don't have neither the strategy or foresight, nor the soft policy tools to help stabilize once they have created a regime collapse. We need to take into account USAID is not anymore there, and there has not been proper support for the Venezuelan opposition for a democratic breakthrough. So the question here is the United States truly conscious or understanding what are the consequences of the level of temperature raising that they're making?
Mm-hmm. And you're arguing they're not. A lot of Venezuelans, though, are pinning expectations on the U.S. intervention because they hope it might bring about an end to the Maduro regime and a democratic transition. How likely an outcome is that, really?
Right now, it's unlikely. We need to take into account that, again, since the United States is not thinking on regime change, but on regime collapse, so they don't have a perception of nation building, they don't have a strategy of what regime would come up once Maduro leaves power. In fact, they have been really adamant that they just want Maduro out. That doesn't mean wanting the full political elite. In many cases, the short-term, most likely scenario is an intra-elite transition, where, for example, the Rodriguez faction, which are the second most powerful in the Venezuelan government, take over the government and while Maduro exiles himself. That would mean a transition in the regime, not a regime transition. For a regime transition, you would need something more like internal pressure from popular forces and democratic forces.
And that doesn't exist? I mean, we're speaking the same week Maria Corina Machado got her Nobel Peace Prize. Doesn't she bring the wherewithal, the capacity, and the entourage to maybe take over?
In theory, yes. And we need to see this with the fact that Maria Corina has not shown any capacity for momentum for a protest organization in the last 10 months, that we don't know how much of the apparatus of the opposition is still in place and how much has been arrested or forced into exile. And the fact that Maria Corina Machado is not in the country anymore, and she will have a really hard time to come back. The opposition doesn't have explicit support from the United States because the Americans have not shown any active support for wanting to change Maduro exactly for them. And we don't know how much internal support they still have. Theoretically, they have the popular support, but we haven't seen the mobilization capacity in 11 months. So we need to really think take with a grain of salt, if Maduro falls, if Maduro is overthrown, how much the opposition is ready for that.
That was Jesus Renzullo with the GIGA Institute for Latin America Studies. Always great to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.